Support for Disrupted comes from the Connecticut Office of Film, Television, and Digital Media.
Every February, the United States celebrates Black History Month. But this year, the celebration might feel a bit different as the Trump administration attempts to change the country's relationship to Black history. Back on January 31st, the Department of Defense announced a change.
In a statement shared just hours ago, the Department of Defense said they will no longer recognize cultural awareness months, including Black History Month, which begins tomorrow.
That announcement came after the administration's rollback of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives within the federal government. That included the removal of some Air Force training videos.
The Tuskegee Airmen were the nation's first Black military pilots who served in World War II, but their story is now being eliminated from the U.S. Air Force training under President Donald Trump's DEI ban.
Those videos were later added back to the training course. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're talking about Black History Month and what it means with a panel of experts. Kevin Gaines is the Julian Bond Professor of Civil Rights and Social Justice and Interim Director of the Carter G. Woodson Institute at the University of Virginia. Christina Greer is Associate Professor of Political Science at Fordham University. And Michael Harriot is founder of ContrabandCamp.com and the best-selling author of Black AF History, the Unwhitewashed Story of America. Thank you, everyone, for being on Disrupted. I am so excited for our conversation today.
Thank you.
I want to get right into it, and I don't want to make any assumptions. So, Kevin, let me start with you. This is a conversation about Black History Month, not just what it has meant historically, but particularly what it means in this moment. And we often hear people say, why do we need a Black History Month? Why is that separated out? You are running an institute at the University of Virginia that has long told these stories. Share with our listeners a little snippet of how Black History Month came to be.
Well, yeah, I am the interim director of the Carter G. Woodson Institute for African American and African Studies. And Carter G. Woodson is the founder of what was established as Negro History Week in 1926. So basically, that morphed into what we know today as Black History Month. And we are currently in the centennial, the 100th anniversary of Dr. Woodson's founding of Black History Month. And Woodson was a historian. He grew up in Virginia. His parents were slaves. He graduated from Harvard and became a professional historian, but he was not so much an academic historian as someone who basically created the infrastructure for the study of Black history in the United States. He founded an important journal, the Journal of Negro History, that promoted scholarship in African American history. And interestingly enough, the Journal of Negro History was African American scholars published in it, white scholars. So he really, I think, laid the foundation for the transformation of the historical profession in the United States from a very anti-Black version of the history of slavery and the history of segregation to the kind of more inclusive, more honest historical reckoning with the past that really is the consensus in the U.S. Academy today.
Michael, Kevin was mentioning how this celebration came to be, how it has morphed over time. And I wonder what it meant for you growing up. For me, it was always memorize these Black facts, memorize these figures, rail against your parents making you get up in church and give some kind of presentation over someone. I don't know, maybe that was just my experience growing up in Virginia, but I get a sense that it's more common. What was the celebration or the recognition of Black History Month like for you?
Well, I used to love Black History Month because I was homeschooled But Black History Month to me, because every like civic organization would have an event, so it meant like a lot of cakes, right? My mom would make cakes for every event, and so there was always a bunch of cake around for Black History Month. And I think what I absorbed was subconscious, right? You attend all of these things, and through the celebration of your history um, during this month, you carry some of that forward, and it builds and layers on top of each other. So, I think we kind of almost take for granted that this one month that we focus on our history is, performative. Sometimes it seems performative sometimes, and it seems perfunctory sometimes, but it really sets aside a time of the month that we build on for future generations, and we lay the foundation so that they won't be miseducated for the rest of those 11 months.
Christina, you are an educator. You are with bright students every day. But you also carry forth this history every day of reminding people, even the people who think they know it all and who think that they understand it, of why it's important to continue celebrating Black history and to also celebrate those pieces that aren't always top of mind. What does it mean for you to celebrate Black History Month and continue that legacy of this is history, this needs to be told, and we need to connect to it?
Black history is American history. So if you don't understand Black history, you have no idea about this country. Our histories are interconnected and intertwined in very complex, brutal, and beautiful ways. And so the idea that only a small segment of the population memorizes great figures in Black history, white students and white people should be enraged that they don't know about their own history in their own country. They don't know about the contributions, whether it's the traffic light or the peanut or ranch dressing or educational institutions. How do you have over 100 colleges and universities, HBCUs? I'm wearing a FAMU sweatshirt right now where my grandfather got his master's. How do you have over 100 colleges and universities you've never heard of before? How have you never heard of the Divine Nine? These are sort of facts about your own history that you are completely devoid of. And so what I try and help my students realize is as we think about current events, and for example, book bannings have always been the case when it comes to Black history. That's why in school, most kids only know about Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, Frederick Douglass, and Harriet Tubman. There's no way that there are only 4 Black people that contributed to this country. There have been thousands upon thousands of people. So when I wrote How to Build a Democracy, from Fannie Lou Hamer and Barbara Jordan to Stacey Abrams, on the one hand, it's to make sure that Stacey Abrams wasn't erased from history, since we've seen that project underway right now, but it was also to remind people of the contributions of Black women like Fannie Lou Hamer, many of whom they've never heard of, or Barbara Jordan, the second Black woman ever elected to Congress. Most people had never heard of her, even my students from Texas. And so when they're looking at Professor Brown Dean or Professor Greer in their classrooms, and we're explaining to them the legacy of Black intellectualism, inside and outside of the academy, inside and outside of American institutions, we don't make sense if they don't understand all of these amazing Black women who have come before us. And so I try and make that connection that although we celebrate in February, and I dressed up and, did my poster and, church, the whole thing. But we should all feel like this is our shared history, and to not understand it is the reason why most people don't understand the moment we're in politically right now.
Michael, let me come back to you because the subtitle of your book, Black AF History, is the unwhitewashed story of America. And I think it connects so beautifully to what Christina is saying, is that when people think of American history, it always centers whiteness, and it always treats the histories and experience of other people as either being non-existent or insignificant to that story of American development. Say a little more about why that was the lens that you said, let me unwhitewash this story so that we can capture the fullness, as Christina mentioned, of the experience.
Well, I think there are 2 reasons that's important. One is because a more inclusive, fuller history is more truthful. There are things that we think about history that are patently not true. And then there are some things that we don't know about history that, is just left out because Black people created it. When you're sitting in a classroom with a teacher and knowing there's a principal and a superintendent, the structure of that education system was invented by Black Americans after the Civil War. The American education system that we know is a Black invention. And so when you start there, right, when you leave out the people who created the things that came to be, right, you won't understand things that don't even have to do with race, right? Like you can't understand why some people live on one side of the town and other people live on the other side. If you don't know about redlining, if you don't know about segregation, if you don't know about the history of Jim Crow, and if you don't know those things, you get to the point where we are today, where you are attacking institutions for what you think is DEI that gives Black people an advantage. So it's not just instructive for understanding the world we live in. I always say that history is not about what happened. History explains what is happening.
And I think we need a lot more of that explanation. Kevin, the most difficult class I ever took in college was African American history with the great professor Reginald Butler. I have never worked so hard in a class. I got a B+ in that class, and you would have thought I had a 100. I took that class, I'm dating myself. I took that class the same semester that the Million Man March was happening in Washington. And to have this great professor start the class by saying, I'm here to undo everything you think you know and challenge you to think about it differently. And so it was exciting when his son, who at the time was with Diggable Planets, walked in the classroom. But that was it for the fun in the class in terms of let's not take it for granted. The landscape that I was learning that history then in the 90s is quite different now, whereas both Michael and Christina have mentioned, you see these attempts to ban books, to erase that history, to challenge whether slavery was as evil and awful as we know. How do you, as someone who has this background running the center, how do you navigate that? The need to tell and understand that correct history within a context that is working so earnestly to prevent that from happening.
Yes, well, thank you so much for mentioning Reginald Butler. He was a pillar of the program, and I'm so glad you had an opportunity to study with him. It's interesting. When I teach African American history, on the first day of class, I ask my students where they first learned about African American history. And there will be African American students who learned about Black history in the way that Michael said, that had gone to and yourself, events in the Black community in churches commemorating Black history or Black History Month. And other students, often, white students from, privileged school districts, just basically say that they had never been taught this history. And we have a great discussion about how rare it is that students encounter African American history. And I've been teaching for, going on 30 years. And, the conversation has been pretty much the same throughout. So I guess the point is that African American history is not taught as systematically in our K-12 schools, across the curriculum. And it's usually, taught in African American schools or schools serving an African American population where they've made an active commitment to that. Now, I've been teaching, as I said, for nearly 3 decades, and I have to say that it never was controversial until this moment. And I think we're experiencing a moment of backlash against the racial and social progress that we've had for the last few decades. And that includes the teaching of African American history. And during the first Trump administration, there were measures trying to discredit or demonize the teaching of Black history. And of course, one of the first executive orders that the Trump administration put out was one called Ending Radical Indoctrination in K-12 Schooling. And if you look at this executive order and the view of history that it advances, um, and really a distorted view of history, I would have to give the executive order an F because it really shows a total ignorance of what history is, and not let alone Black history. Um, it's basically claiming that history, and I guess you would say in this case, African American history is a radical anti-American ideology. And it just goes on with a whole bunch of lies and distortions about, what Black history is. And I think we have to just, sort of check that erroneous view and just say, look, history is fact-based. History is evidence-based. It's not ideology. We talk about actual events that are based on the historical record. And so, historians, they can debate interpretations, but you can't debate the facts. You can't debate the events. And so anything else, it's clear that the motivation of this executive order is to do the kind of whitewashing that Michael was talking about earlier. The American Historical Association and the Organization of American Historians have put out a statement really challenging this executive order, and I would rely on the historians. I would rely on the experts. I wouldn't rely on these political hacks and ideologues for any kind of representation of Black history.
That was Kevin Gaines, Interim Director of the Carter G. Woodson Institute at the University of Virginia. Christina Greer is Associate Professor of Political Science at Fordham University. And Michael Harriot is founder of ContrabandCamp.com and best-selling author of Black AF History, The Unwhitewashed Story of America. Coming up, more on what Black History Month means this year. We'll hear about why the White House might be recognizing certain Black Americans and overlooking others. This is Disrupted. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're talking about Black History Month and what it means at this moment. We're joined by Kevin Gaines, Interim Director of the Carter G. Woodson Institute at the University of Virginia. Christina Greer is Associate Professor of Political Science at Fordham University. And Michael Harriot is best-selling author of Black AF History, The Unwhitewashed Story of America. In 2020, President Trump talked about prejudice and hardship in his Black History Month proclamation. Those words were notably absent in this year's proclamation. Ask Christina about the meaning of Black History Month in 2025.
Well, it's more important than ever. I think in the crisis mode that we are in our American democracy, it is my hope that more Americans, and not just Black Americans, feel the need and the necessity to learn more about their history, since they see it being systematically erased on so many different levels, not just from the history books, but from classrooms and the congressional record. Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan said, we're all entitled to our own opinions, but we're not entitled to our own facts. And as Kevin said, sometimes the facts, all the time, the facts are just the facts. Our interpretations can be one thing, but these things did happen. U.S. chattel slavery did occur for centuries on this land. Redlining was real. There's a reason why some people do not have generational wealth, because of the allocation of the GI Bill, or because of the negotiations made in the New Deal to exclude Black female domestics. All of these things are real. They're not my opinion, and they're not my feelings. So to think about this particular president, who has now chosen to surround himself with avowed white supremacists, many of whom are from South Africa, who believe in apartheid state. We have to remember the words of Bell Hooks, who's not a historian, but her books are slowly but surely being moved out of classrooms left and right. But when she reminds us that the American project is predicated on white supremacy, anti-Black racism, patriarchy, and capitalism, we have to understand that has been the past, and we are looking at our leadership right now doubling down on those four principles to try and move us into a new era of the 21st century. So for me, it's incumbent upon myself to continue to educate myself and the people around me, and obviously my students, to weave in Black history in every class that I teach. I teach introduction. We're talking about the framers and, George Washington. And yes, I talk about Ona Judge, his enslaved African that he hunted to the ends of his days. Yes, I talk about the fact that he did not free his enslaved Africans as promised. Yes, I talk about how he put the teeth of enslaved Africans in his own mouth. No, they were not wooden. Yes, that is a myth. So really working in the ways that this country has been brutal.
Michael, let's talk about the ways that the White House this year is recognizing Black History Month. The proclamation that came out named a few Black Americans, Frederick Douglass, Justice Clarence Thomas, and Tiger Woods. At the time we're having this conversation, last night the White House held its Black History Month celebration, and it included noted guests such as Lil Boosie, the rapper, Byron Donalds from Florida, who the president is supporting in his run for governor, as well as supporters of the current president who cheered on the confirmation of Kash Patel as FBI director by holding up a cutout picture of Pastor Jamal Harrison Bryant and saying that FBI director should go after Bryant first. I'm still confused about how you get such a large photo cutout through White House security, but that's a different kind of question. What's the message that you think the White House is sending by choosing these particular figures and these particular people to hold forth as, if we're going to acknowledge and celebrate Black history, these are the people that we have to celebrate?
So the message is clear, and you have to understand history to know that message is that there is a particular ideology and a particular framework that they will only recognize Black people's humanity, and it has to fit theirs, right? So when you talk about Byron Donalds, you're talking about probably one of the most junior elected officials, national elected officials in America, but he comports with Trump's ideology. You talk about Tiger Woods, so they don't have a, bipartisan, even Frederick Douglass, right? They misinterpret the idea that Frederick Douglass was a Republican because they don't read Black history and understand what that means. And if you notice, there's another name that you didn't mention, who is, everyone listening to this, on this program knows the name that's always brought up in that circle is Thomas Sowell, who's this right-wing Black bootstrap ideologue who's generally considered by the economics community as a hack, but he's always lifted up as the Black economist that perpetuates that mythology. But if you go back to what Christina said, right, and, we clutch our pearls when we hear that term, white supremacy. But if you study Black history, you'll see that this moment mirrors a part of American history where in the previous times during Reconstruction, they explicitly said that's not a Black term. The people like Ben Pitchfork Tillman and Abraham Lincoln, and they reinforced the idea that white supremacy is the order to which they thought America should work in. And that was the premise of making America great again, right? And so once you read and know and study the history of the people who compose this country, then you understand what you're seeing when you see that group of people essentially sicking the FBI on a pastor at a Black church.
Share with us and our listeners why you think that particular pastor, because some of our listeners may not be familiar with Pastor Bryant or why he would be the person singled out. What do you think is at play with that particular focus?
So Jamal Bryant is a pastor in a church, I think, in Baltimore. He has been a long time outspoken critic of the Trump administration. Not just, I don't like him, but he is critical of the political ideology that attacks the people in his communities and the use of Christian ideology and the Christian right under the guise of Christianity to attack Black people. And he's been an outspoken critic of Trump, and we have to understand, he's been effective. He is not just a guy who preaches from a pulpit. He's an organizer. He's a person who's on the ground organizing movements, and he's become a target for the MAGA movement even before this Black History Month.
That was Michael Harriot, founder of ContrabandCamp.com and best-selling author of Black AF History, The Unwhitewashed Story of America. Christina Greer is Associate Professor of Political Science at Fordham University, and Kevin Gaines is Interim Director of the Carter G. Woodson Institute at the University of Virginia. Coming up, the panel discusses how Black people have responded to challenges in the past. This is Disrupted. Stay with us. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're talking about Black History Month in the current political moment. We're joined by Kevin Gaines, Interim Director of the Carter G. Woodson Institute at the University of Virginia. Christina Greer is Associate Professor of Political Science at Fordham University. And Michael Harriot is best-selling author of Black AF History, The Unwhitewashed Story of America. During his first term, President Trump wanted to honor some people in a sculpture garden called the National Garden of American Heroes. The garden would recognize people like Ronald Reagan and Aretha Franklin, Medgar Evers, and Shirley Temple. He brought that idea back into his new term. I asked Christina who she would honor in such a garden. And a note for our listeners, this segment references sexual assault.
I mean, the numbers of women who have organized in this country, who have not given up on this democracy, who have had to deal with the intersectionality of being Black and also being a woman in a country that has not been kind to either group. That is what I would think of. A Septima Clark, an Ella Baker, a Gloria Richardson, who just recently passed not too long ago. I mean, those are the types of women that will complicate this whitewashed narrative of the United States. I mean, our origin story is fake and false and a lie. I said on a panel the other day, I was like, we criticize North Korea for having a fake origin story. We have a fake origin story. And we just perpetuate it time and time again, as though this country has not been brutal to almost every single group that stepped foot on its shores for decades, if not centuries. So we know this president doesn't read. He's a proud non-reader. As an educator, that makes my blood boil on so many different levels, because he advocates, I just know things. I don't have to read. He surrounds himself with many people who don't read, and he doesn't respect history, to say nothing if he doesn't respect people, but he doesn't respect history. And as Michael mentioned, to understand this moment, history explains this moment. And so what worries me is the anti-intellectualism. To want to know about people who came before you is somehow now seen as elitist and, off of the scale. How do we understand where we're going and making sure we don't repeat the same mistakes, which we see ourselves going on in international ways, without knowing what our ancestors and the people who came before us, what they did, what they learned? I mean, this is why I always explain to my students who are organizing on campus. People have done this before. You guys aren't the first organizers. You're not the first ones who, disagree with the president and the administration or whatever the issue may be, why don't you read about what the students who came before you have done so you can learn from their mistakes and actually do more with less and faster?
Kevin, I took a group of my students down to North Carolina A&T State University in the fall, and they got to meet and hear from the great David Dennis Sr., who talked about what it was like to have to eulogize his friend, who was one of the 3 civil rights workers kidnapped and murdered in Mississippi. David Dennis Sr. is the kind of person that I would see as an American hero, whose name may not be as widely known, but whose impact on student organizing, activism, community is profound. It seems like this National Garden will come to be. Who is someone that you would say should be featured in that National Garden of American heroes?
I would have to mention John Lewis, who, was arrested many times, really, walked the talk of nonviolence and was beaten for his commitment to civil rights on a number of occasions. Later elected to the Congress, and he was the conscience of the U.S. Congress as a representative from Atlanta for many years. Of course, after his passing, all of his Republican colleagues seem to have forgotten him and everything that he stood for. Following on your suggestion of Dave Dennis, and talking about the civil rights workers who were killed in Mississippi in 1964, it's really important that Americans know that there were white Americans who were involved in the struggle and were committed to the struggle. So, James Chaney Jr., African American civil rights activist with SNCC, lost his life, but he was side by side with a couple of white activists, Andrew Goodman and Mickey Schwerner. And so, if you think broadly about folks who should be in this National Garden of heroes, American heroes, I think of Ida B. Wells. Paula Giddings, the historian, wrote a book about Ida B. Wells and called Wells the first civil rights activist or the person who was really instrumental with launching the modern civil rights movement in terms of her anti-lynching writings and arguments. Of course, Harriet Tubman, someone who is really legendary. And, the other thing that's so astounding about Harriet Tubman, she's this tiny woman who, had actually a disability, that she was prone to, sort of seizures and fits. But she went back into the South numerous times to liberate enslaved people at tremendous risk. I mean, these are familiar names. I think, of course, in the civil rights era of Thurgood Marshall, the first the person who was led the team that got the Brown decision, the Supreme Court decision, desegregating schools in 1954. And then also Constance Baker Motley, who was the first Black woman who was appointed to the federal judiciary. I would add, I think Billie Holiday is one of the more consequential African American entertainers in that her art and her performance were aligned to the struggle and aligned with the struggle against lynching. And so I don't know if I mentioned John Brown. I think that would be a really radical idea. John Brown was a white abolitionist who hated slavery and was prepared to take up arms against slavery. And of course, he led a failed insurrection that was going to try to overthrow slavery and was executed.
I also think if we have certain entertainers and individuals, let's have the full story. The whitewashing of MLK has been a project that, I think astounds so many people who've ever read anything beyond, the 5 sentences of his I Have a Dream speech. Even Rosa Parks as a rape investigator. When I tell that to my students, the bravery that she had going throughout the South, investigating brutal crimes against Black women, they have no idea. They thought that she was just this cute, petite, demure little woman who one day just woke up and decided, I'm not going to move. She was an organizer herself. She, put herself in incredibly dangerous situations. So I think even if we have certain folks on the list that are quote unquote known to many Americans, let's actually have their full stories so we know. I mean, Martin Luther King didn't die of old age or cancer. He was assassinated. There's a reason why he was assassinated, right? There's a reason why Malcolm X was assassinated. I mean, these are also, when you have people who think and write and organize, they are a threat to the fundamental foundation of this nation in a lot of ways.
Michael, what about you? Are there any more current figures that you would include in a national garden of American heroes?
We think of these people as people who existed long ago. Like, I met Amelia Boynton, right, who was an organizer, who really organized what we know now as the Selma to Montgomery March, and then raised a son who desegregated buses and was a freedom rider. So like we think of the people as as these people as far away in the past, right? And so there are people who are alive and well today, or people who have been recently passed away that deserve our recognition, and we think of them. Some of the great educators that we've missed out on, right? A John Henrik Clark, right? That is one of the foremost pushes for what we're talking about now, the extension of Black history and in the academic area. There are, you talk about we talking about living people. Dr. Greer at Howard University is a cultural icon that deserves recognition. We go back into this even before the civil rights movement and talk about people like Robert Smalls, the people who essentially founded American democracy. People like Joanne Robinson in Montgomery, Alabama. I am always partial to push people from South Carolina. So you're talk about Edwards versus South Carolina, the high school kids that are all alive now. All of them. I think my uncle was the first to pass, and he was the youngest who protest at the State House in South Carolina that pushed the Supreme Court to essentially say that protest is a form of speech that can't be outlawed just because you don't like what they're saying. So when the police were restricted at January 6th, that was because of living Black people who fought for the right to protest. And all of those people are alive today. And one last person is Cleveland Sellers, who is walking around right now, like who was a political prisoner, one of the only political prisoners that was like incarcerated and convicted during the civil rights movement, was the subject of the bloodiest event of the civil rights movement, the Orangeburg Massacre. We never talk about that. Cleveland Howard is an American icon, and he lives and walks around, and I talk to him every time I go to South Carolina.
In this dizzying flurry of all that's happening, what Toni Morrison described as the very function of racism is that distraction. What are you focusing on in these times? What is it that you are centering yourself on to go forth with purpose and intention and not be deterred by what we're seeing?
Well, so much of what we're seeing coming from the president is performative. Much of it is very real, sure, and there's a lot of danger, there's a lot of fear, but a lot of it is performative. So sifting through that, I always read to help me understand these moments. Gwendolyn Brooks is my favorite poet, but I read a lot of Gloria Naylor. Books are like a good wine collection. You don't have to consume it the second you bring it home. They are there for you to just open up some pages some days and read some words. Langston Hughes, as a writer, not just a poet, always grounds me. Black people have a long-standing, complicated relationship with nature and the outdoors. I spend a lot of time outdoors. I know Michael, spends a lot of time in the South on the land. I am a birder and I hug trees, literally. So in this moment, recognizing that so much of the hysteria and urgency is actually, some of it is not urgent, and slowing down the pace. It's like I am the point guard of my life. So I actually can control some of and much of the pace of what's going on. And then this is, somewhat controversial for people to digest, but I fundamentally believe that my ancestors are stronger than his. So I'm not afraid of him. I don't feel fear right now. And I know a lot of families do feel fear. And it is my job to, if I don't feel fear right now and I feel divinely protected, it is my job to rest and to work so I can help others who may not have that opportunity. I am currently in a profession where, I am documented thus far by the definitions we're using today in 2025. I'm not in a mixed status family. I don't work for the federal government where I'm worried about my job just disappearing overnight because some random unelected individual has decided so. So there's a particular safety that I have in this moment at least where I can stay clear-headed because so many other people are in need. And so that's the focal point. Al Sharpton talks about this in the past. When you see geese flying in that triangular formation, that head goose is taking all the headwinds. So the others can they're working, but they're not working at 110%. So you have to rest up so that when that head goose needs to go to the back and rest, you were in position to do the work and you were ready to take all of that headwind. I'm somewhere kind of in the middle. I'm working, I'm writing, I'm doing talks, I'm teaching kids. But pretty soon it may be called upon me. And I felt like I was the head goose for much of the election season. So pretty soon I'm going to either need to be up front, facing all the wind. And once I do that, then I can drop back and rest a little bit. So I'm sort of gearing up to be back up front in the queue. But I also have to recognize that so much of this shock and awe is to destabilize us, is to make us feel disorganized and disoriented. But as we've mentioned, all these brilliant organizers, many of whom were Black women, it's like I come from a tradition on this land of people who have done this before. He is a symptom of this country. He is not brand new. He is using old playbooks with new people. But I have to just stay focused on what is real and what has happened in the past so I can identify it and be prepared for it and organize with others to combat it.
Thank you, Professor, for being focused and committed. And I think, Michael, it's this reminder that these communities are not leaderless. They are leaderful. And there are many people who are on deck and ready to go. One of your newest pieces has this tagline. You are great with taglines, by the way. Has this tagline, the coup is finished, but we are not. Talk to us about that statement.
Yeah, I think we're in a moment where what we fear would happen has already happened. The thing that we thought that Donald Trump would do is already finished, right? The Secretary of Education will be a person who has never worked in education and will dismantle the Department of Education. It is done. The Kash Patel, the director of the FBI, will target Donald, is a man who said before Donald Trump was elected, if I am in this administration, I will hunt down Donald Trump's enemies. That is finished. Elon Musk, billionaire, grifter, white supremacist, race scientist, has been put in charge of looting the American information system, and we are unprotected. He has your social security number, he has your tax information. That is finished. We are the only people who can stop this from happening. Your senator, your congressman cannot do it. They will not do it. The laws that were written by the people who are going along now will not stop him. The judges will not stop him. We are the only people who can stop him. And we have done it before. We did it during Reconstruction. We ended slavery. We ended Jim Crow. We ended All of those things that I've mentioned are forms of authoritarianism that were specifically targeted at Black people, and we beat them. They do not exist because of Black people, and they could not defeat us. As a matter of fact, every inch of progress towards democracy was because of things that we fought for, and we are undefeated. So the coup that we've been worrying about is over. And we are the only people who can right this ship. And the good thing is, we know how to do it. Our history has shown us how to do it. And we have never not done it. We are undefeated at doing this. And they fail every time. Slavery failed because of Black people. Jim Crow, we dismantled it because of Black people. Right? Like disenfranchisement, voter literacy laws, poll taxes. We beat it all. And this is the next thing we'll have to beat.
Kevin, there is a passion in Michael's voice that is borne out in the histories of the people that you study, that you write about, that you build with in many ways. And we know that progress in the United States always comes in fits and starts. What do you say to people who feel like, I don't know that there is a hope. I don't know that there's a way forward. What do you say to those people?
I would underline what Michael just said, that African Americans have endured, struggled, and prevailed over far worse conditions and situations than we are facing right now. And, I have hope. And I look to African American history for hope and for inspiration. I go back and I reread speeches by Frederick Douglass. After each disastrous development in the 1850s, Douglass would come back and he would just say, okay, now it's on us. We have to keep up the struggle. And I'm sure Frederick Douglass had some bad days in there, but he was just really tenacious and brilliant and committed. I believe that there will come a time when a lot of the people who supported the president, who voted for the president, will be ashamed to admit that they did that. And I believe that in the end, the forces of reaction and oligarchy and autocracy, I feel that they're overplaying their hand right now. And we, as Michael said, we need to stand up as a people and as Americans and just say that, we've never had kings and we'll never have a king.
Here's to standing up and not being distracted. Kevin Gaines is the Julian Bond Professor of Civil Rights and Social Justice and Interim Director of the Carter G. Woodson Institute at the University of Virginia. Christina Greer is Associate Professor of Political Science at Fordham University. And Michael Harriot is founder of ContrabandCamp.com and author of Black AF History, the Unwhitewashed Story of America. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Disrupted is produced by Kevin Chang Barnum, Robin Doyon Aiken, Meg Fitzgerald, and Meg Dalton. Our interns are Angelica Gajewski and Kathy Wang. You can listen to all the previous episodes of Disrupted by finding us wherever you get your podcasts. And you can listen to new episodes every Friday at 9 a.m. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. Thanks for listening.